They say a battlefield never remembers the sound of laughter. But that morning, somewhere along a dusty French road, the silence seemed to replay a strange moment, the moment German generals chuckled at what they believed was America's greatest weakness: logistics. You can almost picture it, a dimly lit map room, cigarette smoke curling like thin ghosts. And over a spread of lines and arrows on the wall, one officer tapping the supply routes and murmuring, almost amused. The Americans won't keep up. Their machines eat fuel faster than they can deliver it. Outside, trucks groaned across ruined bridges. Engines coughed in the cold. Radio men tightened their headphones, listening to messages filled with urgency and doubt. And somewhere in that chaos, a single symbol kept returning: the red-painted circle slapped onto the side of every rumbling truck, a mark that meant nothing to the Germans. Yet, you can feel it, can't you, that sense that something forbidden was about to unfold. A storm building under the surface. A secret the enemy hadn't noticed, not yet. Because in the next few days, those red circles would become the lifeline of an entire army, and the punchline of German laughter would twist into disbelief. And before we follow the roaring engines and dust-choked roads that fueled Patton's unstoppable Blitz, do me a small favor. Tap the like button if you enjoy stories that uncover the hidden gears behind history's greatest moments. It helps more than you think, and the next twist is worth staying for. The map tables were still warm from the officers' hands when the first reports began to collide across the Allied radio lines, columns advancing too fast. Fuel reserves dropping too low, bridges collapsing under the weight of armor that refused to slow down. Patton's Third Army was tearing across France like a blade slicing through cloth, but every mile of progress felt like a drumbeat counting toward disaster. Behind the roaring engines and victorious headlines, there was a darker truth: his tanks were running dry. In the narrow corridors of the field, headquarters officers moved with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Boots slapped stone floors. Radios crackled with unfinished sentences. And everywhere the same refrain echoed over and over: we can't sustain this pace. Outside, a low fog clung to the ground, mixing with the smell of gasoline and metal, as if the land itself could sense the fragile balance between momentum and collapse. Far ahead at the front tank, crews were already grappling with the creeping fear of stalling out in enemy territory. Drivers leaned forward in their seats, fingers tight on the controls, listening for any hiccup from the engine that might signal the unthinkable: an empty tank. Gunners cleaned their barrels not out of habit, but to keep their hands busy, masking the dread tightening in their throats. Commanders stared at the fuel gauges as often as they scanned the countryside for German ambushes. In those moments, the enemy wasn't a soldier with a rifle. It was a needle sinking towards zero. A lieutenant slumped in the shadow of his Sherman thumbed through his last orders with a growing sense of unreal pressure. The words were simple: advance, hold ground, await, resupply. But what did they mean if the trucks never came? What did they mean if the momentum shattered before the breakthrough arrived? Every soldier could feel it. The rush of victory wasn't just exhilarating, it was terrifying. Too fast, too hungry, too dependent on something beyond their control. Behind the front, the supply routes looked like arteries clogged with wreckage from retreating German units, blown bridges, and abandoned farm carts left in panic by civilians fleeing the chaos. Dust rose in thick clouds, coating everything: uniforms, headlights, crates of ammunition, even the hope that fuel would arrive before nightfall. Every stretch of road felt like a gamble, a risk that another bottleneck or hidden mine might choke the entire advance. In a cramped command tent lit only by a flickering oil lamp, logistics officers pored over maps covered in red string and penciled notes. Their voices were tight, clipped, harsh. "We're losing hours on every checkpoint. They can't move through the rubble on Route N24. Fuel depots are too far from the front. We need a new pipeline fast." But the truth was even harsher. There was no new pipeline, no miracle rail line, no harbour big enough to swallow the needs of an army advancing faster than any manual had ever planned for. The situation was spiralling into something no textbook could solve. And yet somewhere beyond these frantic discussions in the dim garages and makeshift staging grounds near the French coastline, an idea was beginning to take shape, one that seemed reckless, almost absurd. A continuous round-the-clock convoy, fast, direct, and relentless. No detours, no stops, no hesitation. A lifeline carved from the roar of engines, and the determination of drivers who barely slept. But at this moment in the story, no one knew what it would become. No one knew the fear that would soon turn into fury, or the exhaustion that would turn into accomplishment. All they felt now was the tension stretching thinner and thinner. The soundscape of the war shifted. Instead of artillery thunder, there was the metallic groan of overworked engines. Instead of gunfire, there was the stutter of radios drowning in orders. Instead of the triumphant cry of liberated towns, there was a nervous silence broken only by the rumble of distant armor, a reminder that speed without fuel was suicide. In one fuel depot outside of Ranch's soldiers worked shoulder-to-shoulder sweat streaming down their backs despite the evening cold. They moved like machinery, lifting jerry cans, rolling barrels, strapping crates, every motion fueled by the knowledge that the Third Army was waiting, counting on them. Not tomorrow, not the next day, now. The depot commander barked, "Move like your lives depend on it, because theirs do." And the men did. Some with adrenaline, some with fear. Some because they simply didn't know what else to do. Inside the trucks waiting to depart, engines stuttered as mechanics tightened belts, checked oil, and slapped the hoods like they were trying to wake up sleeping giants. Headlights flickered on one by one, piercing the dark like a growing constellation. The drivers climbed in, many of them young, many of them black soldiers whose contributions would go unrecognized for decades. But in that moment, they were the heartbeat of an entire army. Above them, clouds gathered, swallowing the moonlight and casting the convoy lanes into thick shadows. Every breath of wind carried the ghosts of battles past. Every faint rumble felt like it could be thunder or artillery. The men didn't know which was more likely, and that uncertainty tightened their grip on the steering wheel. At the same time, German intelligence officers watched the Allied advance with growing alarm. Their early confidence, the mockery, the smirks, the dismissive remarks about American inefficiency was starting to crack. Reports showed Patton's tanks advancing at a speed they hadn't thought possible. Villages that were supposed to slow the Allies down were falling in hours, not days. Entire divisions found themselves outflanked before they knew they were in danger. "What is fueling them?" one German officer muttered. No one had an answer. The roads trembled again as another wave of Allied trucks rolled forward. Dust swirled behind them like a rising storm. Each vehicle carried the same red circle stamped onto the door, the symbol the Germans hadn't yet learned to fear. But fear was coming. Not in whispers, not in rumors, but in the roar of thousands of engines pushing through the night toward a front line on the brink of exhaustion. And somewhere in that restless dark, in the hum of tires and the trembling of steel, the war's rhythm began to change. No longer driven by generals shouting orders or tanks leading charges, but by the invisible lifeline forming mile by mile. This was no longer a question of tactics. It was a race, a desperate dust-choked struggle against time, terrain, and the laws of exhaustion. And the outcome of that race would soon rewrite everything the Germans believed about American power. The engines had been roaring for so long that no one could remember what silence felt like. Night after night, the convoys pushed forward, carving their way through darkness, mud, and enemy fire. The Red Ball Express had become a living creature, a relentless, sleepless giant made of steel sweat and trembling nerves. But even giants have a heartbeat, and tonight it was faltering. Somewhere along the narrow roads outside Chartres, a thin mist drifted low to the ground, swallowing the headlights of the lead trucks. The world seemed to shrink into a tunnel of shadow and dust. Drivers leaned forward, eyes burning, muscles stiff from hours gripping the wheel. Every bump felt like a warning. Every whisper of wind carried the possibility of danger, a mine, an ambush, or simply the moment their body gave out. In one of the trucks, a young driver named Collins tapped the steering wheel with trembling fingers. His radio had gone quiet, leaving only the hum of the engine and the distant rumble of other vehicles behind him. He had been on the road for nearly 20 hours. His eyelids sagged, his breath was shallow, and yet somewhere deep inside a stubborn resolve held him upright. The Third Army needed fuel, that was enough. His partner, a private with a soft voice and rough hands, glanced at him. "You okay, man?" Collins nodded, forcing a thin smile. "Just gotta make it through this stretch." But the truth hung unspoken between them, neither knew if they could. Behind Collins's truck, the convoy moved like a segmented shadow, each part depending on the next. The fog thickened, muffling the rumble of engines, until it sounded almost like breathing. And then from the roadside brush came a sound no driver ever wanted to hear, a sharp, metallic click. Amina. The explosion ripped through the night, tearing open the road with a plume of fire and shattered earth. Collins's truck lurched as the shockwave slammed into it. Metal screamed, windows splintered. And in that fractured moment, all the fear that had been quietly building erupted into chaos. Drivers shouted into radios. Engines stalled and roared back to life. Soldiers leapt from trucks, scrambling to pull wounded men from the blast zone. Dust and smoke mingled in the air, thick as grief. Collins, ears ringing, stumbled out of his cab. His partner lay several feet away, dazed, his breath uneven. Collins dropped to his knees beside him, hands shaking as he checked for injuries. The man's eyes fluttered. "I'm still here," he whispered. Collins exhaled in a ragged rush, but the relief lasted only seconds. Another blast thundered from the tree line, a German artillery shell, this time fired blindly but with deadly precision. Shrapnel ripped through the fog, slicing canvas, puncturing fuel barrels, snapping wooden crates like toothpicks. The convoy scattered instinctively, each man moving with the desperate reflex of someone who has lived too close to danger for too long. A mechanic named Harris sprinted toward a burning truck, coughing as the flames licked upward. He heard a faint cry from the cab, someone trapped. Without hesitation, he tore open the door, the metal searing his palms. Inside, the driver slumped unconscious, his uniform smoldering. Harris dragged him free, stumbling backward as the fire roared higher. Moments later, the truck erupted in a column of heat that rolled over the road like a wave. Shouts filled the night. Some men called for medics, others yelled coordinates into radios. Some simply screamed into the smoke, trying to be heard above the rising storm of artillery. But amid the chaos, one detail stood out, the red circle painted on every truck door, glowing faintly through the haze. It flickered in the firelight like a distressed heartbeat pounding against the dark. To those who lived this night, that symbol would never be the same. Collins, still kneeling beside his partner, felt the tremors of another incoming shell. He shielded the wounded man with his own body teeth, clenched eyes squeezed shut. The explosion landed further down the road, but the shock wave still rattled his bones. Dirt rained down around them. Somewhere behind him, a driver cried out as his truck toppled into a ditch. This wasn't just a supply route anymore. It was a gauntlet, and every man running it felt like a thread stretched to breaking. The artillery eventually stopped, leaving a ringing silence behind. No birds, no wind, just the sound of flames crackling and wounded soldiers murmuring through clenched teeth. The convoy commander gathered the survivors, face grim beneath the soot. "We move," he said quietly. "We don't have a choice." There were no speeches, no defiant roars, just weary nods, men too tired to protest, too determined to fail. As dawn crept over the horizon, the convoy began to roll again. Trucks limped forward, some with shattered windows, some leaking fuel, some driven by men who had lost friends only hours earlier. Collins drove in silence, his partner asleep beside him, breathing shallow but steady. The rising sun cast long shadows across the road, illuminating the symbol on the truck door, the red circle still intact despite the shell fragments that scarred the paint around it. Collins stared at it for a moment. It felt different now. He knew it wasn't just a mark for organization or control. It was a promise that no matter the cost, they would keep moving. Far ahead, Patton's tanks waited. Behind them, countless other trucks were preparing to join the line. And between them, woven through the smoke and exhaustion, were the quiet stories. No reporter ever wrote the whispered prayers, the trembling hands, the signals that went silent without farewell. The world would remember the victories. But the road remembered something else. The night the Red Ball Express paid its price in blood, so an army could keep advancing. Dawn crept across the battered French countryside like a soft apology. The smoke from the night's explosions drifted upward in thin, exhausted ribbons, dissolving slowly into the pale morning sky. The world, which only hours before had shaken under artillery fire, now felt strangely hollow, as if holding its breath, unsure whether to mourn or simply remain quiet. The trucks of the Red Ball Express rolled on, but their once fierce rhythm had changed. The engines murmured instead of roared. The men spoke in low voices, if they spoke at all. Every jolt of the wheels carried the ghosts of the night before, and every mile carved into the road seemed less like a victory and more like a question. How much more can they endure? Collins kept his hands on the steering wheel, though his knuckles no longer clenched white with fear. Exhaustion had smoothed his movements into something slow, deliberate. His partner slept upright beside him, head resting against the window breath, fogging the glass in soft, gentle patches. The world outside slipped by quiet villages, broken fences, fields that looked peaceful only from a distance. For the first time in days there were no explosions, no mines, no sharp commands breaking the morning air. Only the low hum of dozens of trucks and the whisper of wind brushing against metal. It was in this quiet that Collins finally allowed himself to think, really think about what they were doing. The Red Ball Express wasn't glamour, it wasn't glory. It wasn't even the kind of heroism that made it into newspapers. It was grit, nerve. Sacrifice in the most ordinary shape, men pushing forward, because turning back would mean letting someone else fall. He remembered the moment the convoy commander gave the order to move after the attack. No anger, no fiery speeches, just a tired voice asking them to continue because someone had to. The simplicity of it lingered with Collins more than the explosions. War was loud, but responsibility, that was quiet. Up ahead, the early sunlight spilled across a ridgetop, catching the red circle painted on the side of his truck. It glowed softly now, no longer a symbol of urgency or danger. In the gentle light it looked almost like a reminder, a mark of all the miles they had carried, all the weight they had shouldered. It was strange how something so simple, so unassuming, could come to represent an entire lifeline. Behind him, another driver rolled down his window and let the cool morning air wash over his face. He looked older than his years, not because of lines or grey hair, but because of the heaviness in his eyes. When their gazes met, Collins offered a small nod. The man nodded back. Nothing more needed to be said. They were all held together by the same thin thread of exhaustion and purpose. The landscape shifted again. Fields gave way to narrow forests where beams of sunlight pierced through the branches like quiet benedictions. The road wound gently between them, the kind of path that might have seemed peaceful in another life. Collins imagined how this place might look without war. Children playing in the grass, farmers calling to their animals, smoke from chimneys rising soft and blue. But today the only smoke came from damaged engines and burn marks left behind by the battle. The forest bore witness to everything, the fear, the courage, the helplessness, the grit, and said nothing. In the stillness, Collins found himself wondering about the men further ahead, the tank crews waiting for fuel, the infantry relying on supply lines to keep moving, the wounded praying the next town would have a hospital that still stood. Perhaps they too were looking toward the horizon, hoping the trucks would arrive before the day turned sour. And he realized something subtle, something that had been forming quietly beneath all the chaos. This war wasn't won by the loud moments, not by the explosions or the speeches or the triumphant shouts. It was won by the quiet determination of men who kept going even when everything inside them begged to stop. A breeze rolled across the convoy, carrying the scent of wet earth and charred metal. Collins inhaled deeply, letting the cold air settle into his lungs. His partner stirred slightly but did not wake. The day was warming slowly, tenderly, as if trying to mend what the night had broken. As they turned a bend in the road, the forest parted and a wide field opened before them. The sky above was clear now, streaked with soft gold. Collins felt something shift in his chest, not relief, not joy, not even hope. Just a quiet understanding that even in war the world could pause, could breathe, could show them a glimpse of what peace might look like if only for a moment. And he wondered gently, silently, if this morning can be so calm after such a night, what else might be possible when the engines finally stop and the guns fall silent. But there was something no one on the convoy knew. Something buried beneath the calm morning air, hidden behind the gentle sigh of the countryside. Something that would flip the story and reveal why the Germans had been so confident and so wrong. Because while the Red Ball Express raced against exhaustion and time far behind enemy lines, German intelligence had been piecing together a theory. They believed the Americans lacked discipline. They believed the drivers were inexperienced. They believed the trucks would break down long before reaching the front. What they didn't believe, what they couldn't imagine, was that the Americans weren't running a supply system. They were running a miracle. And the twist began with a single captured document. A German reconnaissance patrol operating near Dreux intercepted a small Allied dispatch bag dropped during the chaos of a skirmish. Inside were maps, fuel requests, and a handwritten note from a logistics captain summarizing fuel needs for Patton's tanks. When the German officer in charge read the numbers, he laughed. It seemed impossible, ridiculous, surely a mistake. Impossible, he muttered. No army can sustain that. But then the laughter faded. The numbers kept returning through intercepted radio traffic, through aerial observations, through reports of villages liberated far ahead of schedule. Something didn't add up, and that unease reached the desks of high command. In a dim bunker near St. Quentin, General Blumenthal traced the American advance with trembling fingers. The lines didn't behave like any traditional supply chain. They bent, they curved. They skipped over choke points and shattered bridges as if ignoring them entirely. How he whispered. His aide offered no answer. The twist was beginning to unravel. Because while the Germans searched for hidden depots or secret rail lines, the truth was more shocking. There was no trick, no vast infrastructure, no logistical magic. There were simply men, thousands of them, pushing their limits beyond anything the Germans had calculated. Men driving until their eyes blurred. Mechanics rebuilding engines overnight. Dispatch riders navigating through blackout conditions. And commanders who refused to let exhaustion become an excuse. The Red Ball Express was not flawless planning, it was raw willpower. And on the morning Collins drove through that open field, another revelation broke one from the Allied side this time. The Germans weren't preparing a massive counterattack. They were retreating faster than headquarters realized. A radio intercept confirmed it. German tank units were abandoning positions, not because they lacked ammunition, but because they were afraid of being outflanked by an army that should have run out of fuel days earlier. Patton's greatest weapon wasn't the speed of his tanks, it was the fear creeping into enemy calculations. But the real twist, the one Collins and the drivers of the Red Ball Express would only learn long after the war, was deeper still. Because somewhere in Berlin, a quiet report was being circulated, a confession of sorts. German analysts had underestimated one crucial factor. The Americans didn't treat logistics as an afterthought. They treated it as the spine of the war. And that changed everything. While German tank divisions hoarded fuel for decisive battles, the Americans poured their resources into constant movement. They believed momentum could be more lethal than armor, and so the Red Ball Express didn't just supply Patton. It became the weapon that made his Blitz possible. Meanwhile, back on the road, Collins noticed something odd. The villages they passed, once tense and afraid, now greeted them with cautious hope. Children waved, old men tipped their caps, women carrying buckets paused and offered tired smiles. The convoy wasn't just delivering gasoline, it was delivering proof that liberation was no longer a rumor whispered around kitchen tables. It was real. It was rolling toward them on wheels stained with dust and danger. The twist wasn't strategic, it was human. These villagers didn't know about maps or fuel reports or intercepted intelligence. They knew only that trucks kept coming day after day, night after night, and that the sound of engines meant change. But the final twist of this chapter arrived at midday. A dispatch rider sped toward the convoy, his motorcycle kicking up a tail of dust. He skidded to a stop, breathless, waving a coded message. The convoy commander tore it open, eyes widening. "Patton's spearhead has broken through," he said quietly. "They're ahead of schedule again." Collins looked at the red circle on his truck, the mark that had followed every mile, every explosion, every moment of doubt. For the first time he understood something he'd never considered. Their struggle was invisible to the men at the front. Yet their struggle was the very reason the front could move. The Germans had predicted that American logistics would break. Instead it bent, strained, screamed and bled, but never broke. And by the time they realized it, the Red Ball Express wasn't just a convoy. It was the knife at their back. The war did not end on a single road or with a single convoy. But for Collins, the memory of that long, trembling morning when sunlight returned to the world as if unsure it was welcome stayed with him for the rest of his life. Days passed. Towns shifted from ruins to havens. Roads once scarred by artillery grew softer under the wheels of trucks that no longer carried the urgency of survival. The front lines rolled eastward, pulling the Red Ball Express with them, but the dread that had clung to every turn began to fade. Slowly, gently, the world allowed itself to breathe again. Collins's partner healed enough to return to duty, though the limp in his step never fully vanished. The men joked about it lightly, not to make fun, but to soften the weight of what had happened. Even laughter, awkward, brief, fragile, felt like an act of rebuilding, the kind of sound the war had tried to erase. One evening after the convoy halted near a quiet French hamlet, Collins sat on the back bumper of his truck and watched the sky fade from gold to violet. Children played at the edge of the field, tossing a worn ball between them. Their laughter mingled with the soft clatter of pots from nearby houses, where families prepared dinner in kitchens that finally felt safe again. The trucks lined up in long rows no longer looked like beasts of burden. In the soft dusk, they resembled tired travelers resting after a long journey. The red circles painted on their sides reflected the last of the sunlight, glowing the way embers glow when a fire is nearly out, warm, alive, meaningful. It struck Collins then they hadn't just carried fuel, they had carried the possibility of normal life. Behind him, the men of the convoy gathered around a makeshift table, sharing stories in low voices. Some spoke of home-distant farms, busy cities, the people waiting for them. Others spoke of the night the mines exploded or the hours spent fixing engines by candlelight. But as the minutes passed, the tone shifted. The tension in their voices softened. The burdens they carried felt lighter, as if acknowledging them aloud allowed the wounds to finally begin closing. Across the field, the church bell rang, not in warning, not for an air raid, but simply because evening had come. A gentle reminder that even after everything, time still moved forward. Collins leaned back and closed his eyes. He remembered the fear that once gnawed at his ribs, the shaking hands gripping the steering wheel, the endless nights where the horizon felt like a threat instead of a promise. And yet here he was breathing the same air as children playing tag in the grass. War and peace side by side like two chords trying to form a single melody. Later that night he walked toward the edge of the village where the road curved softly into the hills. The silence was warm. The stars were bright, brighter than he'd seen in months, and the wind carried the scent of fresh earth and hay. He let his fingers brush the cool metal of his truck as he passed it, feeling the dents, the scars, the stories etched into its frame. He whispered almost to himself, "We made it." It wasn't triumph. It wasn't pride. It was gratitude, quiet, steady, deeply human. Behind him, the convoy lights dimmed one by one as the men settled into sleep. Someone hummed a tune, a slow, wistful melody that floated over the trucks like a lullaby. In another life, it might have been sung to a child. Tonight, it soothed men who had seen too much and given too much. As Collins stood under the stars, he thought of all the roads behind him, the burning ones, the broken ones, the ones where friends had fallen, and the ones where hope had risen again. And he thought of the road ahead, still uncertain, still shadowed by the war, but carrying the faint promise of home. The wind shifted, brushing past him as if nudging him forward. He took a slow breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Perhaps healing didn't come all at once. Perhaps it came in moments small, fragile, quiet. A dawn after a night of fear, a field where children laughed, a truck still standing after everything. As he turned back toward the convoy, the village and the soft glow of lanterns flickering in the windows, Collins felt something settle inside him. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. And in that moment, under the gentle hush of a world trying to mend, he understood. The Red Ball Express had carried an army forward, but it had also carried men toward the possibility of healing 1 mile, 1 breath, 1 heartbeat at a time.